This was supposed to be the title of the work of this talk, if there was a title, but I will not dwell on this. Rather, I will jump straight into, that, by the way, is my version of a quote by a bald-headed, bespectacled man, whom will I not name. Okay, so thought experiments, speculation, fictions. I could say that these are kind of one central idea, if I were to kind of name one, which animates or keeps me excited in my art practice. So what is a thought experiment? Thought experiment simply is an experiment which you are conducting, which you're thinking about what would happen if one were to conduct an experiment, but you're not actually doing it in kind of physically. For instance, if you were to think that what were to happen if you were running along a beam of light at the speed of light itself, right? So how would you experience motion? How would you see that beam of light? So you cannot actually run at the speed of light, but if it were to happen, how would it be? This is, for instance, a question. So this notion, or for instance, if you take the example of, say, a neuroscientist who knows everything about, neural transmission, knows about how the eye processes color information and brain signaling, but is an achromatic person herself. So she doesn't, perceive color. So now what would happen that, if this particular neuroscientist who can't experience color herself were to suddenly, experience color? So what would it change that her perception of color, of something which she already knows very well? There's this word called qualia, which is the kind of, when you experience red, the redness of red that you experience has a particular kind of specificity, which is perhaps, very difficult to grasp. So as you see that, the nature of the thought experiment has this as two aspects, that it is connecting with something very, 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 very real, quote unquote, very specific, but yet there is an aspect of immateriality about it. It's trying to get understanding of the natural world without kind of empirical data. So there is a question of speculation. There is an aspect of trying to think the unthought. I know it sounds very pretentious and profound, but you know what I mean, right? So thought experiments, speculations, fiction, speculative fiction. This matrix of ideas. But again, there is a parenthesis there, which there's a small, without necessarily celebrating the technoscientific military-industrial complex or real estate bubbles, because I had to kind of put in that parenthesis, because when you sometimes talk about experiment or speculation, all of those words have also a different set of meanings. And language and its kind of multiple ramifications or multiple contexts is something that interests me. I will not go into the marginalia more. So today I'm going to kind of tell you briefly about two of my works, which are part of an ongoing project around the social history of science in late 19th century, early 20th century India. And the reason I'm kind of interested in the social history of science, not being a scientist or a historian myself, as an artist, why it interests me is that it has a kind of very fascinating intersection of multiple threads, multiple context, histories, narratives. First of all, it kind of opens up this seemingly kind of the truth machine, the objective world of science. It reveals the kind of constructed nature of what we call as truth, the intersections between social processes and what we perceive to be as real, as well as it kind of makes strange what we think was a settled fact. This also allows me to kind of reflect on what is kind of known as historiography, or the kind of the history of history, because the way we understand history also changes. So the way we understood, say, the first war of independence or / Sepoy mutiny 100 years back is very different from where we understand it now. So this project on the physicist, scientist, Meghnad Saha is part of this kind of larger interest. And why Meghnad Saha? You know, one, he was a fascinating figure. I mean, within the scientific world, he is of course very well known, but in the kind of for a general audience, sometimes he's perhaps not as well known as, for instance, Homi Bhabha. So Meghnad Saha started out as an astrophysicist, did pioneering work on thermal ionization, which was a way to kind of calculate the temperature of solar bodies through spectrographic data. Pioneering work, but then at one point he became more interested in the kind of the science and society intersection and became very involved in the Planning Commission as well as in river valley projects. He was a very big supporter of large-scale kind of industrial planning, and he himself came from had his own life journey was fascinating from a kind of humble backgrounds to the very kind of the heart of the scientific establishment, so to speak, as well as trying to talk about Saha. There are whole other questions around class, caste, the way scientific biography interacts with a scientist's actual scientific work. All of these start coming up. The idea in this project is to kind of how to talk about this person, Meghnad Saha, but also around him, and also how to do it in a way which is not just a kind of, say, perhaps a biographic film. You might be able to get some sense of, this is essentially the front glass facade of a gallery, and you see these kind of texts on the glass surface. So this was a work that I had done as part of a group show at the University Gallery of the Ontario College of Art and Design in Toronto. And essentially what you see are, these are kind of, vinyl text on the glass surface. But what the text says is essentially a derivation of Meghnad Saha's equation, thermal ionization equation, but in Bengali. So there are, ionization, for instance, is ayoni bhabon, or thermodynamics is tapgotibidda. But what I did was I retained the actual equations. The actual equations are actually, kept in, so you see half mv square, half m0v square, integration, differentials. So essentially the texture that forms is this kind of script that say for someone who walks into this space in Toronto, they would not know, but yet they see something which looks kind of mathematical, familiar. They see superscript, subscripts, the Roman alphabet, and it gives an impression of, okay, this has something to do with science. Then there was this little text piece on the wall, which kind of offered narrative around what this is. So it said, this narrative, and I'm now kind of quickly paraphrasing what that narrative said. It said that what you see on the glass in front of you is a blown up version of fragments of a paper that was published recently. And the narrative was framed in the kind of near future, 2035. And it said that in 2035, Einstein is a young, struggling physicist in Dusseldorf, and he has figured out a new theorem which will solve the energy crisis, but he can't get his paper published. And then he writes to the brilliant physicist M.N. Saha to get his paper published, possibly in the reputed journal in Bangla called Samosamoyik Padarthabidya, because Bengali is the language of science. And M.N. Saha then gets his paper published, and Saha and Einstein then work on creating the Saha ionization, Saha-Einstein theorem. And what you see on the wall is fragments of the derivation of the Saha-Einstein equation. So this is what it said. Essentially, even when you read it, you would sense that there are kind of speculative aspects about it. But what it does is that it inverts two narratives that are kind of actually historically happened, which is one is an inversion of an actual historical event that happened with the scientist S.N. Bose and his work in quantum theory, which he actually wrote this paper on the derivation of Planck's law. He couldn't get it published. He actually sent the paper to Einstein saying that, I think this work is important. If you can publish it, it would be really grateful. And Einstein did think it important. He translated it himself, published it, got it published, and wrote a note saying that it is an important work, which then went on to, they collaborated on the Bose-Einstein equation, which then produces the statistical class of particles called bosons. So the Higgs boson, the God particle that you might have heard a couple of years back, is a kind of a boson. So, but before this, there was another backstory, is that both S.N. Bose, another colleague and of Saha, they had together translated Einstein's relativity papers into English, which in 1920, and it was published by the University of Calcutta. And that happened to be the first translation of Einstein's German work into English anywhere in the world. So, I mean, these histories then kind of offer you a glimpse into the entire complex relationship between the process of the kind of the social dynamics of science. What is the kind of actual location of science? Is it Europe? What is the relationship of the kind of center of science vis-a-vis its peripheries? What are the kind of power dynamics? Who is the kind of patron? Who is the kind of beneficiary? What is translation? What happens when thermodynamics becomes Tabgotibidda? So a whole host of questions around knowledge, around power, around history, around geography, and the kind of intersections between them. And again, the other larger kind of narrative which this work is that this was the kind of title of the work, an inexhaustible energy source derived from the ionic gradient in the pocosphere after a north-south polar reversal, which is, again, I love kind of creating long titles and making them, the kind of, so it's kind of almost part of the work, which again was a kind of comment on this entire phenomena of emerging economies, which many of you might have noticed. And because this show in Toronto, which was a great show, it was very exciting to participate. It seemed it had a kind of a BRIC flavor. BRIC is Brazil, Russia, India, and China. The emerging economic countries, and whose economies are emerging into something we don't know what. So I was kind of I could sense where the narrative is coming from, but I was also a little uncomfortable with it. And like, who decides what is the economic framework? Who decides what is emerging? What is the emergent threshold? So essentially what was happening, that the next show that was planned at this gallery was, I think, a show of Brazilian artists, and the next show was of Russian artists. So I felt that, this entire kind of, BRIC narrative also comes from a certain, perhaps, kind of anxiety about shifting power relations in the kind of larger geopolitical domain. The emerging, the new century will be an Asian century, and what will happen if the power dynamics change? Would nannies in New York be more in demand who speak Mandarin rather than French? So this entire narrative was kind of an inversion of the, what happens if the global South becomes the global North. So German is no longer the language of science, which it was in early 20th century, but Bengali is. And what happens, kind of an Asian language is, and what happens when that happens. So it's a kind of ironic take on many of these aspects. But one might question that, gosh, what is this? You put some little bit of text on a glass and then go on and on and on. I mean, shouldn't art have like sturdy legs and stand on its own feet? True, it needs to do kind of, foot exercises. But I will come to that point towards the end. I quickly want to show you another work, which was #CloudRumble56. CloudRumble being a kind of tongue-in-cheek translation of Meghnad, the name of the scientist. And 56 was the year in which he died. Kind of a very tragic early death. He was actually on the way to a National Planning Commission meeting, and he had a massive heart attack and collapsed and died. So this was what I called was a Twitter performance. This was done in 2010. So essentially it was a Twitter performance which looked at data from Saha's speeches in the parliament, which he was an independent MP in the Indian parliament, and the various kind of very important interventions that he made. So it was a spoken word performance within the space, and various collaborators in the space were responding to it, and their tweets, which they were sending out, constituted the performance, while no images of the performance were actually shared. So it was a kind of reflection on questions of presence and representation and memory and history. But I think I have overshot my time here, so I will say thank you, and yeah.